Hello. Tonight I was going to talk a little bit about saltwater tanks and, if you're looking for that first saltwater tank, taking a look at recommended sizes and that sort of thing, and the advantages and disadvantages of the various sizes. Um, there are a lot of recommendations out there. People are saying, oh, you have to go, the biggest tank or bigger the better or whatever. And while it's true that a larger tank gives you a lot more forgiveness in terms of, your water parameters, things going wrong in your tank and that sort of thing, there are some disadvantages to that as well. People are suggesting something like a 75 or larger gallon tank, something like that. The advantage to larger tanks, of course, is that it's much easier for you to keep your water parameters balanced in terms of your nitrates, nitrites, ammonia, just because there's so much more displacement in the tank, and so it's easier for toxins to dissipate in a larger tank. Um, the downside, obviously, to larger tanks is, quite frankly, you may not have a space for a tank that size when you're talking about a tank that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 feet in length. That's a pretty good sized tank. So space issues could be a problem. Quite frankly, the biggest problem that you're going to be dealing with is that the initial cost setup is going to be very significant when you're talking about a 75 or larger tank. The biggest thing that you're going to run into is the issue where generally they recommend live rock with a ratio of at least 1 pound per gallon of tank. And when you consider that live rock generally runs between about $5 and $7 a pound, you can imagine that you start timesing that by about 75. That runs into some serious money just for the rock. And then you look at things like sand or live sand or whatever else it might be, and you're talking about, basically $1 per pound, which, in a smaller tank that it's not really as a major expense, but when you're talking about a tank of that size, that's pretty significant to add to that. The other thing is, of course, then you're going to be running into an issue when you have to change the water. You're changing out, like, I don't know, 20, 25 gallons of water at a time, and that can be quite the ordeal in order to make sure you get prepped for it. Especially if you're, doing your own mixes and running your own RO or RODI system or whatever it might be. That takes some planning to produce that much water and do the salt premix and get it right. The flip side is a lot of people are assuming, oh, well, I'll go with a really small tank, what they call like a nano tank. Like a 20-gallon tank or smaller or something like that. The upside to that, of course, is that you can do that with significantly less cost, and generally speaking, as long as you stay on top of water changes, once or twice a week, changing out anywhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 gallons, depending on the size of the tank, you can actually maintain a fairly healthy tank. But the downside to it is that you end up severely limiting your stock in terms of what you can put in your tank. There's a lot of fish that, excuse me, quite frankly, you just can't put in your tank because they require a tank that is significantly larger than a 10 to 20 gallon tank. And as such, between that and just the fact that water parameters, your ammonia, your nitrites, nitrates, those sorts of things, they can spike very quickly on you on a tank like that because there's just not a lot of space or filtration on that. And so between that and stocking issues, it's actually recommended for more experienced users. You can do that if you're looking to just get, just a couple of fish or something like that. That's the other issue is, of course, with a nano tank, anything more than about 2 or 3 fish it's really kind of pushing the limits on that in terms of what your biological filtration can handle and other filtration as well. Um, so you can do a nano tank, but just be aware you really have to stay on top of those water changes. And of course, you are going to have to limit your stock options, and there's only going to be a really small list of fish you can buy. For most people, that brings us to the last category, which is kind of what it's kind of that balance, where you wanna get a decent sized tank, so you got some options for the first time around, but you don't want to go with a tank too big so that your cost is horrendous and your maintenance and water change and stuff like that gets to be in the way. The 30 to 50, I would say about 55 or 60 gallon tanks are probably kind of that sweet spot for a first time saltwater and aquarist or enthusiast. Personally, I went with a 36 gallon bow front, which you can see obviously in the other videos that I've got here. But if I were doing it over again, I would probably go with a 55. The reason that I recommend that is because, if you go to sites like Live Aquaria or various other places, they recommend, when you take a look at minimum tank size requirements for various different kinds of fish, you're going to notice that there's a certain pattern there. You have the nano fish, which generally, minimum tank size about 10 gallons. You have your sort of more medium range fish where they've got a minimum requirement of 30 gallons, such as clownfish, dottybacks, basslets, and some small wrasses. And then you'll see the next big jump usually goes up at 50 gallons, which is where you have things like the Melanaris wrasse and redline wrasse and various other different kinds of wrasses that give you some options there in terms of what you can stock in your tank. The 55 also does allow you to enter the realm of the pygmy angels, such as, say, the different varieties of flameback, African, Brazilian, as well as something like, say, the cherub fish, or pygmy angel as it's simply known, and a couple of the different varieties that they have there. And it's pushing it a little bit, but you might be able to get one of the more peaceful side dwarf angels in there, something like a coral beauty or something like that. Just be aware they tend to nip at corals. But anyways, the point is that a tank of about 55 gallons would give you kind of that sweet spot between giving you a fair number of options for your tank without going overboard. If you have any ideas about tanks, triggerfish, full-size angels, or anything like that, you're going to need, well over 100 gallons for those guys. So just be aware that, if you have any ideas about that, you're going to need a serious tank and a very significant startup cost. So my personal recommendation, kind of that middle ground, as it were, about a 30 to a 55 or a 30 to 60 gallon tank would kind of be the best one to go with for a beginner. Just because that way you can limit the stock, or not the stock, but you have some options for stock. You can set up the tank at a semi-reasonable cost in terms of salt water, without running into the issue of just having this, where you're spending this ridiculous amount of money on live rock. Now, one of the tips that a lot of people use is that they recommend doing a bunch of dry rock, or basically what it is it's dead live rock, and then seeding it with a few pieces of live rock, and then it takes longer, but you can actually cycle and seed that dry rock there, and then what ends up happening is that you end up doing the poor man's way, basically, of starting the tank. And the dry rock you can get for about $3 a gallon, or not $3 a gallon, $3 per pound. So it does save you quite a bit when you're talking about larger quantities like that. So for the once again, my final recommendation is, if you're a new person getting into the hobby and you want to keep the tank modest but not too small, and but still have some options, I would say somewhere in that 30 to 60 gallon range would probably be kind of the sweet spot for you. And that's pretty much about it, and thanks for watching.